The sun had barely begun to rise over the jagged limestone cliffs of Okinawa's southern coast when the echoes of foreign voices drifted into the caves. Inside, more than 1,200 Japanese civilians huddled in silence. Mothers tightened their arms around their children. Elderly men sat cross-legged, eyes closed in exhausted prayer. No one moved. They had learned that even the sound of breathing could draw death closer. Sachiko Yamamoto pressed her 3-year-old son Hiroshi close to her chest. His tiny body was limp and warm, his skin stretched thin over fragile bones. He hadn't spoken in days. Hunger had stolen his tears, and fear had silenced his voice. Around them the air reeked of smoke, unwashed skin, and rot. Every breath was a struggle in the choking blackness. The cave had become a city of shadows. Families from 6 neighboring villages had fled here in April when the first artillery shells began falling. They carried what they could: bedding, pots, infants. But nothing could prepare them for life beneath the earth. 5 weeks later, most had forgotten what the sky looked like. For the children, darkness was all they had ever known. There was no water source except rainwater gathered in rusting cans and stone crevices. It tasted like rust and ash, but was all they had. Food had disappeared early on. First went the rice, then the foraged greens, then the bugs. Now they boiled bitter leaves into black broth, too weak to nourish, too precious to waste. Hunger had etched itself into every face. Illness spread faster than fire. Coughing echoed through the tunnels, joined by groans of fever and the shallow breathing of the dying. There were no bandages, no medicine, no doctors. A small scrape could become a fatal wound. Children were buried in silence, their bodies wrapped in straw mats and wedged into narrow cracks in the rock. Mourning was muted. Grief had no room to grow. And yet, somehow, they endured. In the stifling dark, human order persisted. The elders kept track of the days and rationed what little remained. Former teachers led whispered lessons to keep the children's minds from unraveling. Mothers tended not only their own, but the children of the dead. In that suffocating abyss, they clung to the rituals of life. The fear of the enemy was the glue that held them still. American voices were now audible from the mouth of the cave, calm and unfamiliar. Through a translator, they promised safety, medicine, and food, but no one believed them. Every adult in the cave had been taught that Americans were demons. They raped, tortured, and mutilated. Surrender was worse than death. The propaganda had been relentless. School books, radio broadcasts, even village songs told them that capture meant dishonor and destruction. Rumors told of grenades given out by Japanese officers to families to be used when defeat was certain. Better to die together than to be defiled. Even now, many clutched knives or stones, ready to protect their children from the horror they expected. So they waited, motionless in the dark. Outside, the soldiers continued to speak. Inside, hearts beat like distant drums. And in that moment, no one knew whether the voices beyond the cave mouth meant salvation or the beginning of the end. The island of Okinawa was not just a battlefield, it was a fractured landscape of survival. Its unique limestone geology had created a vast network of caves, tunnels, and underground passages stretching beneath fields, hills, and villages. For generations, these caverns had been little more than places to store tools or escape a storm. But when the American invasion began on April 1st, they became something else entirely. Sanctuaries, tombs, prisons. Entire communities vanished overnight. Families packed only what they could carry: blankets, rice bags, the elderly, and disappeared into the earth. Villages that had existed for centuries emptied in silence as the roar of artillery shattered the world above. There was no time for proper goodbyes or even for thought. The instinct to survive overpowered everything else. The caves became the last line of defense for people who had no weapons. Inside, life regressed to something primitive. There were no walls, no privacy, and no separation of the sick from the healthy. People slept shoulder to shoulder on cold stone floors, their bodies pressed together for warmth. Children played with rocks and sticks in the dim light of burning grass. Smoke from the tiny fires filled every chamber, clinging to their lungs and eyes like invisible ash. Water dripped from the cave walls in irregular streams. It was collected in bowls, jars, and sometimes just cupped hands. But the deeper they went, the harder it became to find clean water. Pools became tainted by nearby waste. Thirst gnawed at them almost as fiercely as hunger. Fights sometimes broke out over a single sip, only to be quickly silenced by the elders. Hunger, however, was the constant tyrant. Within 2 weeks, every grain of rice was gone. Leaves and roots, normally ignored, were now boiled and chewed until bitter pulp became a meal. Some attempted to sneak out at night, risking gunfire and discovery, to find edible plants. Many never returned. Those who did came back with almost nothing, perhaps a handful of grass or a half-rotten sweet potato. Disease flourished in the damp, unventilated air. Dysentery swept through the narrow spaces. Wounds festered without cleaning or treatment. Infants developed fevers that led to seizures. Elderly men and women died quietly in the corners, their bodies covered quickly to keep the stench down. There was no time or energy for mourning. Death was no longer shocking. It was simply part of the routine. Despite all this, some form of order emerged. The oldest men, often former heads of villages, were given authority. They rationed food, mediated disputes, and decided when it was safe to speak. Teachers, though starved and weak, led soft-spoken lessons with bits of charcoal and broken wood, scribbling in the dust. Mothers formed childcare circles, helping one another manage the impossible burden of raising children underground. Still, fear dominated every decision. The caves were not just physical shelters, but psychological ones. They were places where the outside world, filled with gunfire, bomb blasts, and the specter of American soldiers, could not reach. The darkness was terrifying, but what lay beyond the cave mouth was worse. Families clung to each other and to the hope that the war would end before death claimed them. In those caverns, time lost all meaning. Days blurred into nights. Hunger erased the calendar. And though the world continued to fight above them, the people in the caves waited, not for victory, but for the silence that would mean either peace or their final hour. On the morning of June 18th, a scouting team from the 96th Infantry Division moved cautiously through the rocky terrain of the Kian Peninsula. As they passed a narrow gorge lined with jagged limestone, one of the men noticed signs that didn't belong to nature: ashes, broken twigs, footprints, and the faint smell of smoke rising from a crack in the hillside. These weren't signs of soldiers. They suggested something larger, more desperate. Perhaps a civilian hideout, or something worse. Command was alerted immediately. Captain James Morrison arrived by midday with a small unit, including Sergeant Robert Yamamoto, a Nisei soldier born to Japanese immigrants in Hawaii. Yamamoto spoke fluent Japanese and understood the cultural fears embedded in those hiding. His mission was clear: make contact and prevent tragedy. If this cave was filled with civilians, as suspected, a single wrong move could result in mass suicide. The Americans had seen it before. The mouth of the cave was narrow and shadowed, like the entrance to another world. Morrison held his men back while Yamamoto stepped forward, his hands raised to show he was unarmed. He called out gently in Japanese, "We are American soldiers. We are not here to harm you. We have food, we have water. Please come out." His voice was swallowed by silence. The cave gave nothing back. Inside, the civilians froze. The adults immediately recognized the accent. Foreign, soft, yet unmistakably American. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men reached for knives and crude spears, their hearts pounding. Could this be a trick by the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police? A test of loyalty? Surrender could mean execution, even torture. For a long moment, no one dared move. Yamamoto kept speaking. He described the rice and canned food waiting outside. He talked about the wounded civilians already being treated by American medics in nearby camps. He even mentioned his own parents, who lived peacefully in Honolulu. His voice cracked as he promised safety over and over against everything these people had been taught to believe. Slowly, something began to shift. At last, a voice responded from within the cave, an elderly man asking who Yamamoto was. Yamamoto stepped closer and repeated his name, his family, his intentions. After more whispers from within, a figure appeared near the entrance. It was Taeshi Nakamura, a respected elder, chosen by the group to test whether the Americans truly meant no harm. Every eye inside watched him take that first step into daylight. Nakamura emerged with trembling hands, his body hunched from weeks underground. His eyes struggled to adjust to the brightness. Morrison signaled his men to lower their weapons. One of them approached and offered a canteen. Another unwrapped a rice ball from a ration pack and held it out with both hands. Nakamura looked at them in disbelief, expecting a blow, but instead received kindness. Captain Morrison extended his hand. Nakamura hesitated. Yamamoto explained that this was a sign of peace and respect in American culture. Slowly, shakily, Nakamura reached out and shook the captain's hand. Then, in a gesture that crossed cultures, he bowed deeply. Morrison, uncertain at first, bowed in return. It was a silent moment of recognition between two enemies who were no longer enemies. From inside the cave, whispers turned to conversation. Children began to cry again, not from pain, but from hope. Nakamura turned and shouted into the darkness that it was safe. The spell of fear began to break. Years of indoctrination started to crumble in the face of water, rice, and a bowed head. Something that had been frozen deep inside those caves finally began to thaw. The emergence began slowly, cautiously. After Nakamura's safe return, small groups of civilians started crawling out of the cave, shielding their eyes from the sun they hadn't seen in over a month. Mothers with babies came first, believing that soldiers might spare the young. Then came the elderly, the sick, the weak. Every step out of the shadows was a gamble between life and death, but each survivor who was greeted with food, water, and a gentle voice gave the next the courage to follow. Many soldiers moved quickly to provide aid. Tents were erected. Buckets of water were passed down the lines. Cans of food were opened and distributed without hesitation. Medics knelt in the dirt, treating wounds that have long gone septic, checking fevers, and cradling infants who hadn't cried in days. Many soldiers had seen combat, but the sight of these civilians, so starved, so skeletal, shook them deeply. While the main entrance cleared, a young infantryman named Private Thomas Murphy noticed a narrow shaft to the side, barely more than a slit in the rock. From within, he thought he heard a faint whimper. He called over Sergeant Yamamoto, who crouched by the opening and listened. There was a voice, tired, trembling, in Japanese. A woman was trapped inside with her child. The tunnel had partially collapsed during the bombing. Through the thin space, they learned what had happened. The woman's name was Haruka, and her son's leg was pinned under a rock deep inside the collapsed passage. She refused to leave without him. The boy, only 5 years old, had gone silent. She had stayed by his side for days, feeding him scraps of boiled leaves and whispering songs into his ear to keep him alive. Her voice cracked as she pleaded for help. The opening was too narrow for stretchers or tools. Without hesitation, Private Murphy volunteered to go in. He removed his gear, passed his rifle to another soldier, and crawled into the shaft with only a flashlight and a small crowbar. The rocks tore at his uniform and skin. The air was hot, thick with dust. It took him 15 minutes to reach them. The scene inside was heartbreaking. Haruka clutched her son, who lay silent, his face pale and lips dry. The rock pinning his leg was heavy but movable. Murphy worked carefully, sliding the crowbar into the crevice, prying with every bit of strength he had. At last, with a grunt and a cracking sound, the stone shifted. The boy whimpered. Haruka gasped in disbelief. Murphy backed out first, carrying the child in his arms. A cheer went up among the soldiers outside. Medics rushed forward, wrapping the boy in blankets, giving him water. Haruka followed, her eyes filled with tears, dirt streaking her cheeks. She reached for her son, and then, behind her, a rumble sounded from the cave. Before anyone could react, the shaft caved in completely. A cloud of dust exploded from the rocks. Murphy was still inside. The entrance collapsed in on itself, sealing the passage with a deafening crash. Haruka screamed, clawing at the stones. Soldiers pulled her back. Others scrambled to dig, but it was too late. For hours they worked, but the tunnel was unstable. Eventually, the digging stopped. A moment of silence was held as Captain Morrison stood at the edge of the cave, helmet off, eyes lowered. A few days later, the Japanese villagers who had been rescued returned with a small stone marker. They placed it beside the collapsed entrance, inscribed in both English and Japanese. To the American soldier who gave his life for a mother and her child, we will never forget. In that dark cavern, surrounded by death and despair, Private Thomas Murphy had chosen light, and in doing so, he had become a part of their story forever. In the days following the rescue, the area outside the cave transformed into a makeshift sanctuary. Dozens of tents rose across the uneven ground, filled with men, women, and children whose eyes still flinched at sudden noises. The American soldiers, exhausted from months of combat, now found themselves performing a different duty: feeding, washing, and comforting the very people they had once been ordered to fight. It was an uneasy peace, but it felt more human than anything they had known since landing on Okinawa. Meals were simple but miraculous to those who had lived underground. Cans of rice and beans, broth made from army rations, bits of canned meat and chocolate bars passed from hand to hand. For many, it was their first real meal in weeks. Some were too weak to chew and had to be spoon-fed. When the food touched their lips, tears ran down faces that had forgotten how to cry. Sergeant Yamamoto wrote in his journal that day, "They looked at us like we were ghosts, bringing warmth instead of fire." The children were the first to recover. They began exploring the camp, timidly at first, then with growing curiosity. One small boy, Hiroshi Yamamoto, was handed a bar of chocolate by Staff Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez. He stared at it for several minutes, unsure what it was or if it was even safe to eat. When he finally bit into it, his expression changed from suspicion to wonder. The soldiers laughed softly, and some of them turned away, pretending not to wipe their eyes. Medical tents overflowed with patients. Army medics worked around the clock to treat infected wounds, malnutrition, and dehydration. Some of the cases were beyond saving, but most could still be helped. The stench of rot and sickness was replaced by the smell of antiseptic and clean bandages. Corporal Benjamin Chen, who had treated countless combat injuries, later said the civilians were the hardest to look at. They were not wounded by bullets or bombs, but by time, fear, and neglect. Beyond medicine and food, there was an effort to restore something even more fragile: dignity. American soldiers learned to remove their boots before entering family tents. They bowed to the elders and let them speak first through interpreters. Some even helped wash the elderly, gently and respectfully, understanding how shame could wound as deeply as hunger. These small acts of cultural awareness began to rebuild trust more effectively than any speech could. As the days passed, education and laughter began to return. Japanese teachers who had once given lessons in darkness were now given pencils, paper, and chalk by the Americans. They gathered children under makeshift canopies and began to teach again. Some lessons were in Japanese, others mixed in simple English words the soldiers taught them: son, friend, peace. The sound of children repeating those words carried across the camp like the echo of a new beginning. The soldiers, too, were changed. Many had entered the war believing the enemy was faceless and cruel. Now they found themselves playing games with children and tending to the wounds of strangers. Letters home described the scene with disbelief. One wrote, "We came to fight monsters. Instead, we found people just as scared as us." These encounters blurred the line between victory and compassion, reminding everyone that war did not have to erase humanity. In the evenings, as the sun sank behind the hills, soldiers and civilians often shared quiet meals together. The Americans brought out cans of soup and coffee, while the Japanese offered what little they had: boiled greens or rice salvaged from ration supplies. There was little talk, only nods and soft gestures. A strange peace settled over the camp, not written in treaties or orders, but born from simple acts of kindness. It was during one of those evenings that Sergeant Yamamoto looked across the fire at the group of children chasing one another around the tents. He realized that what had happened in those caves would outlast any battle report or medal. It was proof that mercy could exist even in war's darkest corners. The chocolate that once melted in a frightened child's hand had become something much greater: the taste of humanity rediscovered. As word of the cave rescue spread across Okinawa, its impact rippled far beyond the forested hills and coastal cliffs. Civilians hiding in nearby caves, long paralyzed by fear of American cruelty, began to reconsider their fate. Stories of food, medicine, and kindness traveled by whispered conversations and cautious messengers. The rescue of 1,200 souls proved that surrender did not mean slaughter, it meant survival. What happened in the limestone cave became a quiet turning point in the battle's final days. Soldiers quickly recognized the strategic and symbolic value of what had occurred. Soldiers who had once been tasked with clearing bunkers now found themselves escorting villagers, not prisoners. Humanitarian aid became an operational priority. Field hospitals expanded. Supply chains redirected resources to support the rescued populations. It was no longer just a military victory, it was a moral one. But not everyone adapted so easily. Some civilians remained wary for days, even weeks, certain that punishment must still come. They walked carefully, eyes low, waiting for violence that never arrived. Others, especially children, embraced their new reality with open hearts. Bonds formed between young survivors and American soldiers who taught them English words and played simple games with them in the dirt. Slowly, a different kind of healing began. Sergeant Yamamoto became a cultural bridge, not just a translator. His presence in uniform, Japanese face, American voice, confused and comforted many. He answered questions about democracy, about families in Hawaii, about what peace might look like. One elderly woman told him, through tears, that she had once prayed never to see an American. Now she thanked God that he had come. Such conversations did not erase the past, but they planted the seeds of a future. In the weeks that followed, the Americans established schools in the refugee camps. Supplies poured in: paper, chalk, notebooks, children's readers. The lessons included both languages and taught more than words. They taught trust. Teachers who had once instructed children to fear the foreigner now led classes beside him. Laughter echoed in places where only weeping had lived. In the ashes of war, a fragile foundation was laid. Medical recovery continued as well. The worst cases of starvation were stabilized. Wounds closed. Infections faded. Dentists treated broken teeth. Psychologists, rare even in wartime, sat with survivors to speak about the trauma of darkness and fear. Though primitive by modern standards, these efforts were revolutionary in 1945. The idea that mental wounds mattered was itself an act of compassion. Then there was the monument. When the villagers learned that the soldier who had saved Haruka and her son had died beneath the collapsed tunnel, they mourned as if he were their own. Days after the last civilians emerged, they returned to the cave's side entrance. Using stones, they built a small, humble shrine. A single plaque bore his name, Private Thomas Murphy, who gave his light for hours. Flowers were left each morning without fail. That monument remained for years. Even as Japan rebuilt, even as cities rose from ruins, people came to that place. Former children brought their own children. Stories were told around the shrine, not just about war, but about courage, empathy, and the moment when an enemy became a savior. It was a reminder that the deepest humanity can emerge in the darkest places. For many, the cave rescue marked more than liberation. It marked transformation. Survivors who once believed the world was divided between monsters and victims began to see the gray between. They remembered chocolate in an open palm. They remembered a soldier crawling into danger for a child. And they remembered that sometimes the strongest act in war is mercy. In the final accounting, the rescue of the underground city was not recorded as a major battle or a decisive blow. But for those who lived through it, it was everything. It was life, and it was hope. And long after the last shot was fired, long after the uniforms were folded away, the memory of that day continued to echo, in voices, in stone, and in the light that followed the darkness.